Hello and welcome to another episode of the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting either side of the breach. On today's episode, we have the start of an epic story that will change the world of Malifaux forever. Terrible portents have made themselves known. The Burning Man blazes brighter than any star, and the world's greatest powers are making their moves. I hope you enjoy part 1 of Malifaux Burns, right after this word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by Old Ivan's Divination Services. Old Ivan is a gifted haruspex with the power to see the future in the entrails of sheep. Just bring a live lamb and a handful of script to your appointment. Your prophecy is guaranteed 100% accurate.
Not a guarantee.
Malifaux Burns by N.A. Wolfe. High above earth, a man bleeds. Except he is not a man. At least not any more. He is a corrupted constellation. A hellish tattoo imprinted against the heavens in blazing ink brighter than any star. The air warps at his touch. It is so hot that all nearby moisture pops and evaporates with a guttural, tortured hiss. For miles the surrounding clouds are ash-choked. Colored dark like charred steel, they congeal with embers and dust. If the people below could witness them, they might think of the swollen bellies of great black ticks, ready to vomit forth a blistering hail of hardened slag and scalding rain. The man's limbs are forever frozen in place, splayed like those of a Vitruvian sketch. Yet he is but a sick simulacrum of the human form. Flickering constantly, his contour is coarse, smudged, and harsh. It resembles the opus of a sculptor who began to carve the foundations of a true masterpiece before a sudden bout of primal madness drove him to attack the marble with his crudest, bluntest chisel. The man's stocky arms and legs roil with flames, pulsing and flaring, as raw magical force pumps arterial magma to the irregular beat of a non-existent heart. His hazy, boiling form drifts listlessly through the night, as if obeying the whims of a primordial sentience, though he has none. The man, if he can even be called that, follows a great change in the air. Not so long ago, under a distant sea, something monumental had occurred. When a fragile barrier between worlds collapsed beneath the Atlantic's icy depths, the ensuing maelstrom carried more from Earth than just frigid waters into Malifaux's own oceans. It stole something else, too. An unexpected prize, with enough technological and arcane power to destabilize the brittle tunnel that had engulfed it. The vortex disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, but not before its thoughtless digestion of an unexpected meal cut a jagged scar into the bowels of reality. Each day after, the frail sutures of this festering wound grew weaker and weaker. The man in the sky could not sense it. He could not sense anything. But he was drawn towards the tear, as if attracted by a magnet. Soaring above continents with no recognition of the world below, he followed the path of least resistance. Wading through invisible currents, he was dragged thousands of miles like a toddler's kite on a bucking string. Now, after months of inexorable drifting, he finally arrives. With the steady rhythm of a sleeping giant's rumbling breaths, he begins to hemorrhage. His essence spills into the vacuum between worlds as swiftly as water bursting from a cracked levee. High above earth, a man bleeds, and bleeds out. For the second time in his unnaturally long life, Euripides, first haruspex and lord of the high mountains, was blinded. He could no longer ordain the skeins of fate. The sensation was utterly alien to one so ancient and gifted in the sacred rites of prophecy. It had been over a millennium since his first blinding, when his Basilissa, his queen, had sliced her spidery fingers into his skull and claimed his right eyeball for her own. But Titania did not take without giving back in return. She had merely sacrificed Euripides' second eye to empower a third, his seer's sight. Then the blinding had only been partial, and the pain swift. A small price to pay for such extraordinary power. Now Euripides' torment was ceaselessly agonizing, and he had never felt more powerless. It had begun only a few weeks ago. One night, in the depths of a cave overlooking the boundaries of the Autumn Queen's great forest, the gigant had awoken in a panic, his third eye painfully trying to comprehend everything it saw. Vivid tableaus swirled in his future sight more quickly than he could process them, slipping through his memory like sand falling from a sieve. An ancient city burns, engulfed in hungering flames. Smoke and ash clog the streets. Hazy shapes scatter and scream, trying to outrun a towering inferno. Flames dance, smoke billows, and embers drip from toxic skies, blanketing everyone below in a flaring shadow. There is no hope, no escape. And above it all, a man burns. He is so bright. With the visions came a sensation of purest agony. It was as if the very flames Euripides had witnessed were gnawing at his old bones and flooding his capillaries. The pain forced him to accept that he was indeed very awake. In that moment, the seer felt himself flit back and forth across the hazy linements between present and future. Part of him could see the gloomy cave and feel the bite of the crags beneath his leathery feet. But the rest of him was drowning in fire, forced to endure the grasp of the torturous vision on the very fabric of his spirit. The other gigants were roused from their slumber by the sounds of his panic. Deeply unsettled, they gathered around their lord. He was sitting upright, clutching his head in one massive hand and muttering dark curses in the old tongue. A few of the assembled gigants made tentative steps towards Euripides, but another lance of immolating heat burned through the elder's mind. He wailed, lashing out with monstrous claws before collapsing to his knees on the cold stone. The gigant raked his face and body, as though trying to let the fire consuming his thoughts escape through gaps in his weathered flesh. Euripides had spilled blood so many times he barely perceived its scent, heavy with iron and prophecy. It fell in thick droplets onto the snow and trickled down the ridges of his face. The instant he felt that stickiness on the pads of his fingers, Euripides called upon his sight, hoping, praying, that the blood would offer a sign explaining what he had just endured. Once again the seer's vision was engulfed in flames. Euripides howled in anger, torment, and frustration. He focused his entire self on the tiny rivers of crimson, trying desperately to see past an inferno with no end. Sweat mingled with the blood pouring from his brow. Euripides eventually staggered, placing a hand down and covering the patterns his blood had wrought upon the snow. The scalding sensation on his graying skin did not cease. It remained, enveloping him and infesting the space just behind his missing eye. Many days had passed since that night. For weeks, Euripides had cautiously tested the limits of his magic, trying desperately to see once again. But even after treading the depths of his darkest, most primordial magic, he could discern nothing but the undulating outlines of raging flames. The fire always returned with a vengeance, and so too did the pain. That image had now seared itself into his ethereal vision, as vividly as a brand imprinted onto blistering flesh. At last, Euripides resigned himself to a terrible thought. Either the old ways were failing him, or something terrible was coming. Something only he could see. Despite the pain racking his body, Euripides addressed his followers, his voice rumbling across the peaks. "The time has come. We must return before the next full moon." The gigant began to walk down the slope of the mountain. The others followed. Together the tribe lumbered over hills and frigid dales. They wasted no time to hunt, instead feasting on dried meat and taking water from fresh springs. Euripides did not eat or drink. His only dreams were those of fire and of his queen. After 2 long weeks beneath Delios' greenish, waxing light, the giants arrived at the border of the impenetrable forest that the Fae claimed as their own. Euripides straightened the hides across his shoulder and turned to his people. "This ground is sacred," he said, single eye moving across the assembled giants. "Our queen awaits, and her law binds us. Tread lightly. These are her lands." Without another word, Euripides moved into the thorny briars of the wildlands and toward the autumn court. There was no path. Instead, the world seemed to create one for Euripides. As if anticipating his arrival, barbs, foliage, fallen trunks, and scattered stones reshaped themselves at the gigant's every step. Fairy lights, dazzling sparks of brightest blue and golden yellow, lit his path. The sound of predatory birds, hissing insects, and barking quadrupeds rang in his ears, a symphony of such terrible beauty that they could drive mad any unworthy of hearing it. A sweet musk of earthen moss, damp mulch, and drifting pollen wafted into his nostrils. For so long this impossible world had been his home, and Euripides felt a pang of nostalgia linger at the periphery of his hardened spirit before he dismissed such foolishness and banished it from his mind. The path wound and wound, taking them deeper and deeper into the forest. Soon a great clearing opened before Euripides and his followers, and he knew that they had returned to the autumn court at last. The autumn queen's innermost sanctum was changed but familiar. Euripides beheld the strong, thick boughs bursting with thousands upon thousands of brassy leaves intertwined in a great arboreal dome that sheltered the autumn queen and her court from the open sky. Hundreds of fairy lights, floating above the packed earth floor like glimmering firebugs, brought both illumination and warmth to the massive, imposing space. The queen's knights had gathered to receive him, their hollow eyes dripping fresh blood. Half-skeletal Rougarou and the vicious Bultonkin lurked at the court's shadowed edges. There were also things Euripides did not recognize, creatures and magic that tainted the fey ground. Faint poles of necromancy tugged at every root. Scars from conflicts long resolved were now covered with blossoming grass and flowers. The tang of blood also ran through the grove. The Queen's Drew had used the letting stone to induct outsiders into the autumn court. At the far end of the arena-like clearing sat an enormous throne of gnarled roots intertwined more tightly and sturdily than woven steel. The throne was nearly as large as Euripides himself. Soft flower petals of ruby and cinnabar bloomed from the seat and the arms, creating a velvety covering softer than the finest silk. A sapling grew from the throne as well, holding a long blade inside its branches. Within the eaves of the throne was a figure, immaculate and eternal. Despite his own premonitions, Euripides could hardly believe what he saw. Titania, the third law, keeper of the old world, the storm and the withered rose, and the autumn queen, rose from her throne. She was just as regal as Euripides remembered. The queen had replaced her white satin shift with a flowering dress and armor plates of thick enchanted oak and mahogany. Her pauldrons were studded with dense thorns, and atop her head, golden twigs had twisted themselves into a sharp, pronged crown. 2 dark, pitiless sockets ran freely with blood. Euripides felt an old anger wash over him. His queen should never have befallen such a fate. The autumn nights, resplendent in their own elaborate armor made from the bounty of the wold, similarly cast their eyeless gaze at Euripides, Ashlyn first amongst them. Their hands clasped the hafts of their weapons. Euripides knelt, old joints creaking. The other gigants did the same as they continued trickling into the clearing. "Rise, seer," Titania ordered. Ashlyn and the other guards loosened the grip on their blades. "I have eagerly awaited this meeting since my return. The court was not expecting your arrival so soon, nor in such numbers." Ashlyn's voice cut through the reverence. Her annoyance was evident. Euripides looked at her with a cold eye. "Watch your tongue, Drew," the gigant rumbled softly. "The safety of my queen comes before all, even fate itself. Far more so than you." Ashlyn made to respond, but Titania silenced her with a gesture and raised her voice. "The Autumn Court welcomes the Lord of the High Mountain and his people, our kin. There will be no conflict here. This is a time of celebration." Titania began descending her throne. As one, the Autumn Knights moved to clear a path for their queen. Euripides waited until she touched the ground before taking steps to close the distance between. A warm smile decorated Titania's face. "It is good to see you after all this time, Old One-Eye. Though I am surprised. My Drew is right. You were not expected to answer my call for many more cycles. Why have you quickened your pace?" Euripides bowed his head. "For you, my queen. Even a second's parting was too long." He truly meant it, and he knew that she could detect his sincerity. "I have seen something, a power beyond the expanse of fate, wrapping our world in smoke and madness. Its flames burn me, and all I see is fire." Titania's brow furrowed. "So you have also felt the presence just beyond the ether. It bears the mark of Cherufe, but the tyrant has been changed for some time. Whenever I reach for the skein, he is both present and absent, like a shadow. I did not feel it posed a threat to us, torn as he is across fate. But these fires you speak of, tell me of them." The giant allowed himself a reluctant nod, his eye fixed on the ground in frustration. "The old ways fail me. There is no clarity in the prophecies that will come. Titania became visibly perturbed, but the queen collected herself almost instantly. "The fire clouds your vision?" she inquired, voice even. "When I read the portents, there is only fire and pain, and nothing else," Euripides murmured. "You will show me," Titania said. Her wings expanded behind her to their full breadth. Their red and black feathers stained a brilliant crimson by the surrounding fairy lights. Her dress seemed to flutter at the touch of a light breeze, although the autumn court was completely enclosed. A small tremble passed across Euripides' massive frame, but he gave her a gruff nod. "Bring me one of the survivors," Titania commanded. Within moments, a pair of knights arrived with a struggling captive. She was a young woman, perhaps no older than 25 or 30, though Euripides had little conception of the human lifespan. It was a mystery to him how a species that lived for such a short period of time could be such an utter nuisance. She was disheveled. Wiry hair wadded to one side of her pale scalp with dried blood. The knights released her, and she fell to the ground. She avoided the shadowy depths of Titania's gaunt eye sockets, but gritted her teeth. "You bitch," the woman hissed, covering the fear in her throat with anger. "Hush, child," Titania cooed, switching to the clumsy language of humans. "Your suffering is at its end. You are to serve a greater purpose now than you ever would have before." The woman's defiant expression turned to horror as she caught sight of Euripides stomping toward her. The gigant ripped her in half. She was dead before her body hit the forest floor. Gritting his teeth and preparing himself for what he knew would come, Euripides sank to his knees, feeling the blood of his victim pool between his toes as he peered at the bisected halves of the human's body. There was little fat. Each organ was healthy and dark in color, their wet edges ripe with prophetic offerings. The entrails uncoiled as Euripides pulled their ribcage further apart, sending a staccato of blood raining onto the forest floor. The old gigant tried to make connections, tracing arterial sprays around freckled organ meat and splintered bone. Titania watched impassively as Euripides immediately gasped in pain. Heat radiated from his grey skin, and his eye was alight with a dancing flame. Yet he persisted, fighting to muffle his agony as sweat poured from his brow and trickled into his matted beard. Finally, Titania tilted her head, and Euripides withdrew his bloodied hands, groaning with exhaustion. "What did you see?" the queen asked. The entire grove waited in silence for the gigant's answer. Euripides tossed the corpse to his followers. Meat was meat, and it was not to be wasted. A brief tug of war broke out between some of the gigants as they split flesh from bone, manners not yet refined by the court. "Flames," he answered, "and death. Malifaux on fire. A man surrounded by uncontrollable power, screaming in silence, bound with the brightest chains I have ever seen." Titania nodded thoughtfully, eyes narrowed. "Then you were right to hurry. What Cherufe has become, this thing that blinds you. He will set the skein aflame and burn through reality itself." "The skein?" probed Euripides, blood still dripping from his hands. "The flames, he should have realized." "To set fate itself on fire," the giant whispered, almost to himself. Titania took a moment to respond, contemplating. I did not anticipate his ability to cross into this world. It will require all my power to prepare for his arrival. She gestured at the glittering dome of the autumn court. The old magic can shelter us from the skyfire here, but for how long, I cannot say. Euripides' head thundered with every word Titania spoke. What of the others? He asked. Few read the signs as you can, my haruspex. Their sight will be as burned as yours, though I doubt they know that time is coming. Euripides took a moment before responding. Eternally wise, my queen. But this blindness... Who am I without my sight? He spat. You are as you once were. Ordinary. A weakened thing. You are of little use to me so long as you suffer this suppression. We do not have much time before his arrival. Fortunately, I know another way, said Titania, a knowing smile breaking across her gaunt visage. Something powerful enough to cut through this clouding smoke. Euripides waited. Do you remember the teachings of the old ways? The words I spoke to you the moment I blessed you with your gifts? Titania's hand formed a claw, and she mimicked plucking the missing eye from the gigant's head. The oldest magic is that of sacrifice. To see, one must first be blinded, Euripides recited. Yes. She glanced down at the blood at Euripides' feet. It was a look of curiosity rather than regret. Our magic is most potent when the caster gives up something particularly valuable. Euripides nodded. Although robbed of foresight, he had a strong sense of what his Basilissa was about to say next. You are strong, old One-Eye, she said, extending her hands and beckoning him to the throne. He approached. Just the way I made you. Delicately, she lifted the worn leather wrap that covered his right eye, staring at the scarred socket, which he had gouged clean millennia ago. You are strong, because of everything you have sacrificed. The Thusia, he mused. My sacrifices have always been others. I cannot read my own blood. Titania nodded darkly. This is magic, at its very deepest and strongest, my haruspex. Beyond the limits of what even the most savage practitioners dared to make known. Even the Etekethai of the Nephilim, for all of their mutilations and blood magic, do not know that which I am about to share with you. They cannot see as I once did, said Euripides determinedly. They are not worthy of it. Titania shook her head. And you may not be either, she said scornfully. Euripides flinched, as though struck. The sacrifice must come from you, priest. If you are to see again, you must earn that right. Titania flexed her dexterous fingers, and Ashlyn stepped from the side of the throne. She handed her knife to the Fey Queen, who took it and gazed at its edges. Countless cuts this knife has made. We are all bound through blood, to the vows made at the letting stone. Now you must bind yourself. This ritual will sever your power from all things, so that it can be reborn, and let you see beyond these flames. Titania let the knife leave her grip. The gigant took it almost without thought. She touched the side of his face. where she had first given her gift of prophecy and sight. Now Euripides understood. "Where?" the gigant asked softly. He pressed the blade of the knife against the flesh of his chest, as Titania sent images of harsh runes flowing through his mind. "Start there," his queen instructed, pointing at a place right above his heart. "Be neat. Eventually your flesh must heal and become revitalized. That which is already ruined is no sacrifice." Euripides nodded and began the ritual. After he had etched the third symbol, the maddening heat afflicting his mind seemed to diminish. Frost caked the dirt at his feet, and tiny icicles began forming in his beard. The blood of the sacrificed mercenary had already frozen in a pool of gleaming crimson. Each rune glowed a bright coral red, gradually pushing back the fires and replacing them with the familiar frigid cold of true sight. It was ensnaring and intoxicating. He felt empowered and fearless, rejuvenated and potent. The gigant watched beads of his lifeblood fall, laying out reddened pathways before freezing into crystalline droplets. Each tiny fractal wove a new destiny guided by fate and fate alone. In them, Euripides saw everything. "Your rule is inevitable," Euripides intoned as he stood upright, surrounded by an aura of ancient magic and frost. The bloody knife hung almost forgotten in the gigant's grip, as a deluge of power coursed through him, linked by the runes carved into his body. "As it always will be," declared Titania. "His arrival changes nothing for me, especially now that you are prepared. I will not be denied again. Not by him, not by anyone."
That's it for another episode of the Breachside broadcast. Join us next time for the continuation of Malifaux Burns.